Hey, good morning, everybody. It's Mr. Rader here for economics, and today we're going to be looking at scarcity. All right, we're going to try to examine how scarcity influences our answer to the central question of economics. So, this opening prompt gives a very good example of what scarcity looks like in the marketplace. Take a moment and I'll read it to you all. In 2009, Kanye West introduced the Yeezy sneaker that retailed for $215. His company released 1,000 pairs of Yeezys to the public. They sold out immediately, and the sneakers sold in the secondary market for up to $4,000. How do we explain the meteoric price for these sneakers? And the answer really comes down to two general concepts in economics known as supply and demand, which you've probably heard of before, and they exist because of scarcity. So, in terms of understanding why the price went up so fast, was because the supply was so limited, there was a high level of demand. So, because the supply level was low, the demand was high, the price skyrocketed. So, what we're going to be looking at for now, up until the end of the year, is really two things. You're going to be looking at macroeconomic theory and personal finance. And because we are on a shortened schedule, you'll notice it is May 12th. We only have about a month or so of economics instruction. I'm going to focus heavily on personal finance. I think that's really important for you when you leave high school. And what I'm going to do over the next couple of days, I'm going to put together a Google form of the personal finance topics that you all might have an interest in as an interest form, and I'll guide some of the lessons that I create around the topics that you identify in terms of things that you want to know. The next lesson you're going to see after this one will look specifically at paycheck deductions, and it really ties into the lesson I posted earlier in the semester for enrichment about how to file your taxes. Some of you asked me, how do you file taxes? So there is another YouTube video that explains how to do that step by step. So there's a concept called opportunity cost, and opportunity cost exists because of scarcity. So because there are a limited amount of resources that exist within any given economy, whether we're looking at a personal budget, your own personal finances, or if you're looking at a government budget, say the city of New York or the United States of America, there's only so much money that they get that comes in as revenue, and then there are expenses. So the question becomes, and it really becomes a value choice here, how do we determine who actually gets how much of what? It's a crude way of looking at it, but it really is the central question of economics, which is how do we distribute scarce resources? So the example I include in this slide, and I use this in discussions in class, you could pay thousands of dollars for a pair of sneakers because they have the hype. It's similar to the Supreme logo and the hype that goes around that. But you could easily find regular shoes that range as low as $20 in a local Walmart or Models or JCPenney, etc. And it's important to keep in mind that we as individuals, with our own personal finances, we have to engage in opportunity cost because we have to determine, okay, so if I spend $1,000 on a new pair of shoes, what am I giving up that I could have spent my money on had I saved them? So this brings us to what is scarcity. So the definition reads as follows. It's the fundamental economic problem of having seemingly unlimited human wants in a world of limited resources. Everybody would like to have everything, or they'd like to have their cake and eat it too. But the truth of the matter is, if you're only working with a limited pie as an economic situation, you have to make choices. And those choices drive both our own individual decisions and our collective decisions when we look at the role of businesses and governments. So this speaks directly to a personal budget. You can see it represented here in a literal pie. And you can see that in this case, we see expenses from housing to savings to debt payments to car loans and others as a way of thinking about a personal budget. And we'll talk about budgeting as one of the personal finance concepts, in addition to responsible ownership of credit cards, how to open bank accounts. If we have time, maybe we could have discussions about investments, things like stocks and mutual funds and ETFs. It's going to really be contingent upon the time that we have and also your own interest when you fill out the interest form for topics. When we look at economics, it's a study of how people choose to use scarce and limited resources in order to meet these needs and demands, right? So I'm going to keep emphasizing this. It's predicated on our value system. What are things that we as individuals find to be important, right? And then we look at the public level with a public budget. What are the things that governments find to be essential as like an essential service in order for societies to function properly. So in your Google Doc, you'll be looking at an activity where we look at this key question: who gets how much of what? Like that's our central question of economics. We're going to go through it together. We're going to look at the list of players, things, and ways of how we quantify something, right, in the economics world. What I want you to consider is really two things, okay? The first thing I want you to consider is who is actually benefiting from the system as it exists in our society today. So you'll insert a comment in the document after you listen to this lecture. And then I want you to consider how a society's values and their priorities determine who actually gets the access to these resources, when and how, okay? So this was the key question: who gets how much of what? So who? So when we speak about who, we're really looking at demographics. So when we're looking at different demographic components, it could be men, women, children, governments, corporations, businesses. It could be a developed country like the United States. It could be a developing nation, right? It could be a lot of different players that would be involved in the system of trade, whether we're looking at the individual level with one's personal finances. And again, that could be broken down by age, it could be broken down by gender, it could be broken down by racial group identification. It could be broken down by an individual's income level, their education level, so on and so forth, right? It could also look at it in terms of a national level. Like if we're looking at a government's revenue, they're going to get revenue from taxes. The taxes are paid by individuals and by businesses. Likewise, in the international economy, it's based on trade, and there will be a balance between the developed countries and developing nations, with the benefits tending to skew towards that of the developed countries. So, what are we really talking about, right? What are the things that an economic system produces and distributes? Well, these are some of the various things that are essentially produced and distributed in economies. So we'll look at property, and within property, we have land, we have housing. There are the utilities, so that's your cable bill, that's your phone bill, the electrical bill, might be a water bill, a heating bill, essentially all the different types of bills that one may have to pay when it comes to either home ownership or rentals. The food that we buy, right? Clothes, investments in education, right? If you decide to do higher education, there's definitely an investment, and there are trade-offs. There's opportunity costs involved. If you decide to delay your entry into college for a year, well, what does that mean for your income earning potential when you leave school, right? Those are those kinds of questions that one has to ask themselves when making these kind of complicated decisions. So we're also looking at jobs in an economy. What are the kinds of jobs that are being valued or promoted in the economy? So, for example, when we look at the stock market, there's two major, well, there's more than two, but there's two major indices that tend to be talked a lot about in the United States, and that would be the Dow Jones Industrial and the S&P 500. Now, there's another index, the NASDAQ index, as well, that measures the tech sector, but there's a very, very strong influence, particularly in the Dow Jones Industrial, with the role of essentially very, very large corporations, and how well they do influences the larger market as a whole. So those kinds of things tend to be prioritized. Taxes in a system. What kind of a tax system do we really want? So then there's the exchange between the taxes that people pay and the services that they receive. So, for example, in France, they have a universal healthcare system. So individuals don't pay for individual health insurance, but for the typical middle class family, they're paying a good 45 to 50% of their income in taxes. By contrast, in the United States, we don't have a universal healthcare system. We have employer-based healthcare system. We have private insurance. So this might be, for example, the Affordable Health Care Act, Marketplace, Obamacare. And it can also include Medicare for senior citizens and disabled people, and it can include Medicaid for people for low-income residents who meet certain income thresholds, right? So the taxes that we pay for the same general income as, say, the French worker will pay about 20 to 25% in terms of our relative income. So yes, we pay less in taxes, but then we get less in terms of the government service. So there's that opportunity cost built right there. Transportation, communications. So this deals, for example, fiber optic cable networks, right? Telephone lines, internet capabilities, so on and so forth. Electronic devices and vacations, right? We make choices. How do we decide to spend our money? One person may want to buy that brand new pair of Yeezy sneakers. Another person might be like, I want to book a flight to Europe. A third person might be like, I need a new car, right? And then somebody else could be like, well, man, get a used car and then use the extra money to pay off this bill or to take this trip. It all comes down to the value judgments. So how do we quantify this, right? How do we say how much of something? So these are the sizes, right? Quantities and amounts. It could be currency based in terms of dollars. It could be the amount of a product we buy. Okay, so now the question then becomes, well, what does scarcity actually look like in practice? So I'm going to show you 4 different images that illustrate scarcity in action. And what you're going to do is fill out the graphic organizer about that image that you chose to analyze, looking at the 5 W's plus H. And I want you to make inferences based on what you see to explain how scarcity influences the larger community. So this is the organizer you're going to fill out. You're going to write down the image letter. You're going to write out basic who, what, when, where, why, whatever you can fill out based on your understanding. What inferences can you make based on the photo about the community? What resources does this community have an abundance of, if any? What resources are scarce or limited in the community? And what impact does this have on the community? So these are the 4 images that I chose to use for this lesson. We have hand sanitizer on Amazon. We have school on wheels in Mumbai, which is in India. A parking garage, elevator lift, parking in downtown Brooklyn. And we have a favela, which is kind of like a slum, a housing area in Sao Paulo, Brazil. And the question again is to consider, how do we see scarcity and how does it manifest itself within these images? Okay. So what I'm going to do now is break down each of these. And at this point, if you would like to pause your video clip and complete the organizer on your own individually, you're welcome to do so. But I will continue to explain each of these different components for those of you that would like to continue listening in. All right. So this is an example of price gouging. All right? You'll notice there's 2 little bottles of hand sanitizer being sold for $300 on Amazon from a third-party seller. And this is a screenshot from a report from CBS this morning. And they're talking about price gouging concerns. Now, if we're going to do the analysis here, well, the what is hand sanitizer? That's what we're talking about. Who is involved? We're really looking at really an American consumer, but it could be anybody internationally who needs to buy hand sanitizer, right? If we're thinking about like why this is a thing, well, as you can see, we're living in very uncertain times, and this particular image was taken during the early weeks of the coronavirus outbreak, thinking about how COVID-19, or its scientific term SARS-CoV-2, as it is a version of the SARS virus, would influence the supply, right, of medical supplies. So in this case, thinking of things like face masks and hand sanitizers and gloves and things of that nature, right? So once all of the major supplies were bought up, now there's a limited amount. They're scarce. So individuals are going to essentially start charging a lot more money. Now, there are states like New York State and California that have price gouging laws. So, for example, in some states, the companies can't charge more than 10% premium on top of the additional price. So, for example, think of like surge pricing. If you, your friends, or your family have ever gone on an Uber ride or know what Uber is, like that, that's an example where there's surge pricing. But then, there's this surge pricing and then there's price gouging. So this is an example clearly of price gouging because you could buy a little bottle like that for $1 in most normal situations. Okay, so what does this reveal about the state of the community? Well, it does reveal a lot of things, right? So we see there's definitely a sense of self-interestedness, right? This sense of selfish desire to make money. It's that capitalistic idea that, well, if there's a large demand, I'll just set whatever price I want. If people are willing to spend the money, well, whatever, good for me, right? A similar idea, I was watching a report on NPR's Planet Money. It's a good podcast about economics, and one of the narrators talking about how she paid $65 for an N95 mask. Now again, normally they're about $1, maybe $1.50 at a local Home Depot, Lowe's, True Value hardware store. But because of the current pandemic, the prices have gone up dramatically, right? Okay, so that covers the first one. Now, this next one's really interesting, and I actually like discussing this in person with my classes. Really kind of thinking like, who or what do we see? So clearly, there's a class taking place on a school bus, right? It was an old school bus and it had been retrofitted into a classroom. And just some interesting details to kind of point out here. So you do have a blackboard. You have fans that are installed to hopefully keep the kids nice and cool. You have kids working with little mini chalkboards, right? So that they can take notes based on what the teacher is going. But you can see that they're very, very crowded together. So, just kind of speaking to our world now as it is in 2020, something like this really wouldn't fly if we were trying to practice any kind of modicum of social distancing, right? I mean, they're all crowded together. Like, that's going to be one of the challenges that all schools have going forward. So, if when you enter college into the fall semester, it's going to be a very, very different world in terms of how schools are going to be structured. So, what resources are going to be scarce? Well, clearly land, right, and clearly housing. There's not enough buildings, I suppose. And this is me just inferring here, for this class to actually hold its sessions. So that tells us something, right? And it's significant because maybe the government is not making adequate investments into its educational system. So therefore, they're having classes out on the school bus. Okay, so this third one is in downtown Brooklyn. It's actually a really interesting image because you can clearly see that the cars are being all piled together and that they're using lifts to essentially make the most out of the limited space that they have. So clearly, in this case, the limited or scarce resource is going to be land and space. And by building vertically, the company is taking advantage of scaling through the systems that they have in order to park as many cars as possible to make as much money as possible, right? So this reveals that in New York City, land and parking is very scarce and is something that can then be commoditized in terms of making money. And last but not least, we have the favela in Sao Paulo, Brazil. We actually saw a similar image earlier this year, although the image earlier this year was looking at a set of condominiums side by side with another favela also in Brazil. And what's interesting to note here is you see the outer area of the favela is essentially a downtown commercial residential area, and then we see basically shantytown slums with the tin roofs, which again, among other things, in the warmer seasons they become very, very warm, right? Very hot, very uncomfortable to live in those situations. So there's a lot of inferences we can make and a lot of visual evidence that we could talk about as well. Just look at the road; it's dirt, right, versus concrete. There's a lot of things that we could look at in terms of inequities that exist throughout the world. All right, so in terms of kind of wrapping up for the day, the big question again I want you to really think about, and it's going to directly relate to our central question for this unit on personal finance and connecting our own abilities to manage money to a value system. So in this case, in what ways does a society's values determine how it answers this question? Who gets how much of what, right? So, just ways to kind of think about different things that people can get. So, are these examples of needs or wants? So, for example, water, I think it's pretty clear it's a need. You need it to survive. If you're unable to drink water for several days, you will die, right? But does everybody need a yacht, a boat? No, it's a want, right? It's very clear what the difference is, right? So, there's different ways to kind of consider needs and wants in our society. And just some last things to kind of consider. If a community lacks access to scarce resources, what options do they really have? Right. So there are different ways to kind of consider. Are we looking at scarcity in food, scarcity in income levels, scarcity of supplies? And then by the same token, if a community or society or a state has abundant access to scarce resources, do they have a responsibility to other communities? Like, should they provide help and support, volunteering services, donating foods to, say, like a food pantry, or to donate financially to support organizations? Like, in regular years, this is a question that students, it tends to be very abstract unless they're living through it. 2020, this is the world that we're living in right now. In many cases, many communities in the country are really struggling with this issue right now. So that is something to kind of consider, especially when we look at hard hit areas like in the current COVID-19 pandemic, like New York and New York City, and we compare that to other places in the country that haven't been hit as hard. And like in terms of thinking about the resources from the federal government, who's actually going to get access to what in terms of loans to small businesses, who's getting prioritized in the first round, and ended up being bigger companies and individuals that had a lot of money, right? It could be looking at the stimulus checks that individuals made if they made less than $75,000 a year, so on and so forth. Okay, and I'm just going to end the slide thinking about scarcity, just to emphasize why this is important. All right. So I already went over the definition with you all, but what I really want you to kind of consider is right here with the balancing scale. When we're trying to manage scarcity, we're really looking at judgments and value judgments. What are the things that we as individuals find to be important when we balance or make our own budgets? And then as a society, what are the things that we can actually manage? So, for example, the limited resources and time, we see land, labor, capital, entrepreneurship, thinking about the factors of production. And then these are all those virtual unlimited human wants, and some of them are needs as well. And these things definitely impact the ways in which resources are distributed. All right, so that's going to draw our lesson to a close for today. I hope you all are able to enjoy the rest of your day. Go outside, go for a walk, go for a jog, go for a bike ride, breathe in some fresh air if you can. Wear a mask, do your social distancing, and we'll check back next time where we'll learn about paychecks and where the money goes. All right, everybody, have a good day.